Welcome back to Revenge, Jess. Every case file begins with a breach, a moment where one party, operating inside a relationship built on mutual trust, decides that the structural protections of that relationship, the loyalty, the goodwill, the shared equity, are more useful to them as weapons than as foundations. This is one of those files sent in by a listener. My mother built something. It was not an accident. It was years of cultivated relationships, earned reputation, and the kind of client trust that does not transfer easily. The kind that attaches to a person, not a logo. She partnered with another woman to help that business grow. She gave her a seat at the table, access to the clients, access to the staff, access to the internal architecture of something that had taken years to construct. The partner used that access to conduct what I can only describe as a quiet, premeditated extraction. While still employed, still receiving a salary, still drawing on the goodwill of the business she was actively undermining. She coordinated the departure of the entire staff. She had solicited raises during this period, citing personal financial hardship, and my mother, who is, by nature, someone who leads with generosity, had approved them. At the point of her departure, this woman was earning more than the owner of the business she was about to dismantle from the inside. She left with a letter. The letter informed my mother that she was taking the employees, the operational momentum, and a significant portion of the clientele. My mother was not invited to come along. I want to pause here because I think it is important that you understand what that moment cost. Not in legal terms, not in revenue, in the human sense. My mother is the kind of person who answers the phone on her day off because a client needs her. She is the kind of person who remembers birthdays, who shows up. What was taken from her was not just a business. It was the primary structure through which she expressed who she was in the world. When a natural disaster accelerated the business's closure the following year, the partners' prior actions had already removed the resilience that might have allowed recovery. The clients were fractured. The staff was gone. The reserves that might have funded a rebuild had been quietly drained through an inflated payroll that served one beneficiary above all others. My mother closed the business. She did not recover quickly. She has not fully recovered yet. The woman she was, present, open, anchored in her community, became someone who avoids public spaces. Someone who cannot walk through her own town without the anxiety of being seen and asked a question she does not know how to answer. That is the breach. That is what this file is about. I am not a reactive person by instinct. I am a thorough one. And thoroughness in a situation like this means beginning not with action but with documentation. The first thing I did was construct a clear timeline. I went back through everything my mother had, payroll records, the raise requests, the correspondence leading up to the partner's departure, the letter itself. What emerged was a pattern with a consistent internal logic. A person who had been systematically increasing her extraction from the business while simultaneously preparing her exit. The raises were not incidental. They were operational. They were the final phase of a longer strategy. Then I turned to the public record. A small town has a surprisingly rich informational ecosystem if you know where to look. Business registration documents, licensing filings, the gap between the professional image she was projecting, the thriving, community-rooted business owner, the pillar of local faith life, and the documented timeline of how that business had been built and at whose expense. What I found was a structural contradiction that any auditor would recognize immediately. The public narrative required that her business success be read as self-made. The documentation told a different story, one of transferred clientele, poached infrastructure, and an operational head start that had been extracted rather than earned. The goodwill attached to her business name had not originated with her. It had been redirected. I also examined her husband's professional status, specifically the discrepancy between his declared disability, which had been central to her argument for compensation increases, and the income streams that public records suggested were active during the same period. I am not in a position to draw legal conclusions from that. But I am in a position to note the inconsistency and understand that inconsistencies, when documented carefully, have a way of attracting the attention of the relevant institutions. Finally, I cataloged her use of local connections. The specific instances where she had leveraged those relationships to apply pressure to my mother's new employment, her professional licensing, and members of our extended family. Each instance was documented. Each one added a line to the file. By the time I was done, I had a dossier. Not a grievance. Not a venting document. A structured, sourced, cross-referenced account of the gap between this woman's public presentation and her documented conduct. The question was simply what to do with it. Strategic disruption does not require drama. It requires precision. You identify the load-bearing walls of someone's public position, and you apply documented pressure to the points where the structure is weakest. In this case, there were three. The first was her professional reputation within the industry. The clients she had inherited, many of whom had not understood the full context of the business transition, had only ever received one version of events. I did not fabricate a counter-narrative. I made the documented version available. Not loudly, not in a public forum designed for spectacle. Through the quiet channels that exist in every small professional community. The conversations that happen between practitioners, the informal networks where reputation actually circulates. The timeline, the payroll records, the letter, the gap between what had been said and what had been filed. Some of those clients had questions they had never thought to ask before. They began asking them. The second point of pressure was the disability and income discrepancy. I am not an investigator, and I did not act as one. What I did was ensure that the documented inconsistency, the gap between the declared status and the active income streams, reached the attention of the agencies for whom that inconsistency is a professional concern. I filed no accusations. I submitted documentation. I allowed the relevant institutions to determine whether the arithmetic required further review. They apparently concluded that it did. The third was her use of local influence to threaten my mother's livelihood. This one required the least intervention of all, because the conduct itself, once documented and presented in the appropriate professional contexts, was sufficient. The licensing board that had been the subject of her interference was made aware of the pattern. The employers she had contacted were made aware of the source and the motivation. Interference is only effective when it operates in the dark. Documentation is light. I did not raise my voice in any of these processes. I did not make threats. I submitted organized records through the channels those records were designed to reach, and I allowed the systems that exist specifically to address these situations to do their work. That is what dismantling looks like when it is done correctly. Not a confrontation, an audit. My mother is still rebuilding. I want to be honest about that, because this kind of story is often told as though resolution is complete, as though the exposure of wrongdoing reverses the damage it caused. It does not. The agoraphobia does not vanish because an institution opened a review. The trust she lost in people does not return because her reputation was damaged. The years of work she put into something that was taken from her do not reappear on the ledger. What has changed is the perimeter. The partner's capacity to weaponize local relationships against my mother has been significantly reduced. Not because she was confronted, but because the documented record of her conduct is now part of the informational ecosystem she has to operate within. The professional community that had only ever heard one version of events now has access to the primary sources. The institutional pressure created by the income discrepancy filing has introduced consequences that are structural rather than social. The kind that do not resolve quietly and do not go away because someone changes their story. She still operates her business. I am not under any illusion that this file represents a complete accounting. But she operates it now within a contained field. The expansion she had engineered, the ongoing leveraging of my mother's former network, the interference with my mother's professional standing, has been materially interrupted. That is the goal of this kind of work. Not destruction for its own sake. Containment, the restoration of a boundary that should never have been crossed, enforced not through anger, but through the precise and permanent record of what actually happened. My mother did not deserve what was done to her. She was generous with someone who had decided, long before my mother knew it, to treat that generosity as a resource to be depleted. The file is documented, the record stands, and the next person who considers doing business with the woman at the center of it has access to a more complete picture than my mother ever did. This has been another Revenge Jess cold-hearted case. The archive does not forget, and neither do I. Subscribe for more cases.